I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking with you a little bit, kind of an extension of the information that we shared yesterday, thinking about the path toward climate neutral beef. And I want to talk about a couple of things that are really, I don't know, technical limitations, you might say, as we embark upon these sorts of conversations about the climate impacts of an industry, much less an individual operation. And so I'm not actually going to go in a lot of detail about the carbon cycle. I'm guessing everybody's pretty familiar with that. One thing I'd like to point out from this pretty complicated graphic is if you think about the primary hypothesis about warming in the atmosphere, it is the imbalance between the emissions of greenhouse gases and their uptake. And so on the left-hand side, I've kind of got that summarized, where kind of a current assessment might be that the imbalance is about 4 gigaton of carbon-containing molecules rather per year. And so that 4 gigaton imbalance is out of 219 gigatons of total release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now that's from all sources, right? So that includes respiration and other sources that we wouldn't necessarily consider anthropogenic. But when we think about that very small, 2% of the total, it starts to help us think a little bit about the precision of measurement required in order to determine if we are in fact in balance. And so the first limitation that I want to talk about is in this entire story is the limitation on our ability to estimate emissions in general. So if we think about how this is typically done, most of these reporting schemes are based on international guidance or agreement, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is viewed as the authoritative body, right, that sets sort of the guidelines or definitions for how greenhouse gas inventory estimates are created by countries. So they define 3 different tiers of emissions estimation for livestock-based emissions, depending on the availability and level of data quality available to a country. Recall that these guidelines are really developed for governments in order to generate country-level inventories of greenhouse gases. So tier 1 estimates are those that use a country or region-specific emissions factor. In other words, a standard amount of methane. I'm talking really here about methane. Methane released per animal per year, and then simply multiplied by the livestock inventory of that species for that country. So this is the most straightforward approach, or simplest approach. Tier 2 methods require a bit more granular data. They're based really on estimates of dietary intake, but because intake is almost impossible to know, especially at the population level, they're most typically based on estimates of energy requirements of animals by class within the population of the country. And so this particular approach, a tier 2 approach, is that used by US EPA when they set forth to generate estimates, the annual estimates of greenhouse gas emissions for the US. The tier 2 method also relies not just on this estimate of intake, but also on a yield factor, the YM, which is methane yield expressed as a percentage of gross energy intake. And that yield factor is set for different countries across the world. Tier 3 is kind of the most data intensive level of estimation required or described by IPCC, requires very detailed animal and individual diet data, and then uses equations or models to estimate methane yield directly from that data. And so as we kind of think about this, I want to first show a graph. Sorry for my bad choice of color palette here. But all I'm really trying to show you here is the US beef cattle inventory over the last 100 years, broken into classes. So the 6 inventory category groups that you see displayed there. And all this is really doing is just giving you a sense of what the inventory dynamic is, because that's going to affect, and for whichever tier of evaluation we take on is going to affect the gross emissions estimate of methane. And so recently we've been working quite a bit to try to understand these emissions estimates a little more clearly. And what I've got displayed for you here is using the tier one. Here I'm calling it FAO because most frequently when we look at FAO or FAO stat data reported from that agency or that organization, that most often they are using a tier one methodology. You see the orange line that says that's a tier two method. And then the blue line is really a tier three method. And here we're basing it on the 2016 National Academy's report on nutrient requirements for beef cattle. And I'm old, so I still call that the NRC, even though it's not properly termed that anymore. But that really does represent a tier three methodology. And you can see that using strictly according to IPCC's requirements, we get three pretty dramatically different estimates, and those estimates diverge over time. In other words, the distance between them is greater as we get into more recent years relative to early in the century. Now, we kind of asked what causes that divergence. And so rather than expressing total emissions across the entire cattle inventory, we describe that data in terms of a methane emission factor. Remember, for a tier one estimate, you see in the red line there, the emission factor is constant. In fact, the IPCC historically utilized an emissions factor for the US of 53 kilogram per head per year in inventory. Now, I'll have a little more on that later, but that's why the red line is flat. It's invariant over time. The other two approaches show some variability in that per head per year emissions factor across time. And the reasons for that are primarily driven by differences in animal body size. So this is the emission factor, assuming that we're basing it on cows. And you can see that over time, there's a general upward trend for either the tier two or tier three methodology, but the tier three methodology accelerates at a greater rate. The primary reason for that separation between the tier two and tier three in this case is that recall that the tier two is based on estimates of the animal's energy requirements, which of course do increase with increasing body size. But the tier three estimate is actually based on estimates of the animal's intake driven by equations from the 2016 NRC. Scales linearly with body weight, whereas energy requirements scale exponentially. And so because it's telling me my connection is unstable, I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off. That's probably an enhancement to the presentation, to be honest, but just to save some bandwidth here at my house. And so again, we see this sort of pretty broad range. If you look at the difference, it's more than a twofold difference on a per head per year basis in the estimated emissions of methane, depending on which of these assessment methodologies we utilize. We could do the same thing at the feedlot level, and notice again that the red line is invariant over time, because in the tier one methodology, there is no distinction for the animal's location or diet type. But in the tier two and tier three methods, rather than being greater on a per head per year basis, these are lesser than the tier one factor, which is, meets our expectations associated with what emissions should look like from higher energy density diets. But it does also indicate the pretty wide range in emissions factor estimates. Now, the 53 kilogram per head per year emissions factor is the 2006 IPCC recommendation, and that is again the one that is kind of the most relied upon around the world. In 2019, the IPCC updated all their emissions factors, and I've put a summary table together here for you. And key things I want you to observe here is that for all the regions of the world where they estimated emissions factors, there were generally increases with the exception of Western Europe. And so what this would indicate is that IPCC increased the per head emissions rate that they estimate for beef cattle over this 13-year period from their initial release. Now, there's some reasons for that. Some of them are increases in body weight, but this kind of indicates a lack of stability over time. The other thing that I'd kind of like to point out is that if this is a country-based analysis, you, on the far right-hand columns, what I've displayed is the relative value compared to the North American estimate. And as you can see in 2006, the North American emissions factor was approximately median within the range of values, whereas in 2019, the American estimate, or North American estimate rather, is the highest emissions factor in the world. This is a bit contrary to what our expectations might be about the relative productivity, but remember, this is a gross emissions factor, not a methane intensity value. And so we'd all like to think that if we have more data, we get better estimates. And so here what I've done is taken that tier 3 estimate, and if you see the green line on this graph, that's the same as that tier 3 estimate that I've shown on the previous slides. But we've now added some additional data to it because there are many models that are available with which to predict methane emissions based on features of the animal and their diet. And so what I've done here is really just tried to demonstrate the range of estimates, even when using one IPCC based approach, and the pretty dramatic range in estimates of emissions from the US beef population that would be generated from that. This is using equations only from the 2016 NRC. And though, if we look at sort of the maximum estimates from those equations and the minimum estimates, that's the blue and red lines on the graph, they actually contain the totality of the estimates from the tier 1, 2, and 3 methods presented previously. Importantly, from the minimum estimate to the maximum estimate is a greater than twofold increase in the estimated methane emissions. Now, this is perhaps more than just trivia, because if in fact greenhouse gas emissions from industries become regulated under, say, a pollution regulation structure or a cap and trade structure, which of these lines would be used for enforceability of that regulation? The other thing I'd like to point out is that there's no compelling reason to think that any one of these estimates is better or worse than any of the others. In fact, what's probably missing from this entire discussion, and maybe is well represented in this slide, is the notion of uncertainty. Candidly, we just don't actually have a great way to know with certainty precisely what these emissions really are. And we could consider that this range, or even some expanded range around this, represents the uncertainty around emissions. And perhaps we should begin to take that into account as we discuss things, especially related to balancing or achieving climate neutrality. So for the moment, let's kind of switch gears and think about another limitation. So let's, accept the reality that we may not have the best overall estimates of total methane emissions, but there's also a limitation in our ability to assess the impact of those emissions on climate factors, especially warming. Now, I'm confident that everybody in the room has read, been told, or otherwise understands some idea about the quote unquote potency of methane. In fact, this term, the potency of methane, is a favorite among journalists that report on climate issues. this idea is that methane is substantially more potent as a greenhouse agent than carbon dioxide. And in the strict mathematical sense, that would be true on a molar basis. In other words, 1 mole of methane um, absorbs and re-radiates more infrared energy than 1 mole of CO2. Now, of course, when we convert that to a mass basis, because methane is a much lighter molecule than CO2, we multiply up that relative difference. And so we end up with these estimates that indicate that methane is an extraordinarily powerful greenhouse agent that candidly are not really fair or accurate assessments of its behavior. Remember that the impacts on warming or temperature change are driven primarily by the concentration of greenhouse agents in the atmosphere. In other words, the amount of the gas matters. And the change in its concentration, particularly of methane, is not relative to a linear accumulation of emissions. I'll show you a graph in just a second. I don't really want to belabor this point, but there are many different ways that the climate impact of greenhouse gases are evaluated, with some attempt to create equivalency factors to compare them all to carbon dioxide. From a policy standpoint, this makes sense because it's much easier to describe everything in one unit, so to speak, rather than having to have a different analysis for each gas. However, this sort of amplifies the problems associated with each of these possible assessment tools. Now, each of those, so I'm kind of assuming you're very familiar with GWP, and you may be familiar with the global temperature potential, which is a derivative measure of GWP. But all of those metrics directly evaluate the mass of emissions and do not relate themselves to the actual change in atmospheric concentration of a gas due to its release. And GWP 100 has kind of become the de facto standard of comparison in emissions reporting. And really, by default, it's difficult for me to determine exactly why that's occurred, other than it is relatively straightforward to calculate and present. GWP 100, though, has been very widely critiqued, and this is really why. Now, if I look at this kind of busy slide here, the blue line represents what I'm calling new inflow, so an emission of methane. So this assumes that in year 0, we had 0 emissions, and then we immediately began to release 4 megaton a year of methane from some source. Could be a natural gas plant or something. And that as we began to release at 4 megaton per year, we maintain that rate of emissions over the next 150 years. The red line represents what the atmospheric accumulation of methane would look like. And you can see that it actually reaches equilibrium pretty rapidly, even in the face of those ongoing emissions over time. However, the orange line represents the cumulative emissions. So if we took each year's emissions amount and added them up over time, that would be cumulative emissions. And you can see that by year 150, the cumulative emissions of methane represented here are more than double the actual atmospheric stock of methane. And so GWP 100 really represents the orange line. And a different metric, GWP star, attempts to emulate the red line. I talked a little about this yesterday, and so again, don't want to belabor the point here. But GWP star does appear to be a better indicator of the relationship between methane emissions rate over time and temperature change. And so it's been postulated as a better metric. Now, if we combine this improved metric of methane impact, GWP star, with the wide variety of emissions estimates that we get from either the tier 1, 2, or 3 methods displayed earlier, this is what the warming equivalent emissions of methane look like. And so what this leads us to is the question, especially if we look there at the 2020 values displayed, those range anywhere from approximately 0 to about 75 megatons per year of warming equivalent emissions. If our goal was to achieve climate neutrality by balancing or neutralizing effectively all those emissions, that's quite a big range of uncertainty how much mitigation is actually required. And so we've kind of had an idea that maybe any of those methods are not necessarily well representative of the actual impact. And so I want you to bear with me for just a minute as I try to talk through this graph. Down, if you look at the green bars, let's let that represent methane emissions that are ongoing over time. And I've sort of extended that line all the way across in blue so that you can see that's the baseline emissions. And let's think of that as ongoing emissions that have occurred since time immemorial, right? Since the beginning of time. If emissions had been ongoing at that rate since the beginning of time, they would have resulted in an atmospheric equilibrium of methane concentration, represented in the blue line there, of about 725 parts per billion by volume. That's approximately the pre-industrial concentration of methane that's often referenced. Now, if we increased methane emissions every 50 years, so you can see the step increases in the green lines, and then you can see what the atmospheric concentration behavior does. It increases rapidly upon the initial increase in emissions, and then achieves a new equilibrium plane. What this indicates is that with ongoing emissions over long periods of time, we rapidly reach equilibrium. And so can we actually estimate the effects of ongoing emissions of methane when step changes occur based on their projected effects on atmospheric accumulation, and then make any temperature projections off of that atmospheric accumulation projection? So we've been working toward a model to accomplish that goal, and I'm going to show you some very preliminary outcomes from that. Here in the kind of bright green color, that's plotted on the right-hand axis, and that represents the observed atmospheric concentrations of methane over the last 100 years. And this is an assembly of data from a variety of sources around the world. So you might say that that's sort of the consensus or global atmospheric concentration of methane. The red dots represent the representative concentration pathways of historical emissions of methane over time. This is the same data series that's used to generate scenarios and climate modeling exercises. And you can see that they tend to trend together, which makes sense, although there's certainly periods where they deviate. Now, if I take that same data though, and we put it into an actual decay model that attempts to estimate the behavior of atmospheric concentration, then the emissions represented by the RCP pathway aren't sufficient to represent the actual changes in atmospheric concentration. And so in the open circles that you see here are what we might term background emissions that must be present in order to achieve the concentrations actually observed in the atmosphere. So we emulated that, and our model fits pretty well. And then we were able to take from that RCP pathway and subtract our estimates of cattle methane emissions according to the EPA methodology that's represented in the green line. So now we have three sources of emissions, so to speak: cattle, non-cattle anthropogenic, and then the background emissions of methane represented by the open black circles. If we combine all of these sources, we can then estimate the change in atmospheric concentration of methane over time, and and then plot that against the actual observed values of methane over time. And in reality, what I've actually done here is in yellow, yellow diamonds represent the atmospheric concentrations of methane as they would appear if there were no cattle emissions from the United States over the last 100 years. And then the kind of brownish diamonds represent the total, including cattle. And as you notice, you can't really see the difference between those two series because over the last 100 years, the difference in atmospheric accumulation estimated with and without cattle is less than 1 part per billion. Now, what that kind of indicates is that even if we use a method like GWP star that's strictly emissions based, all of those methods are built to consider sources of emissions that are quote unquote new. In other words, we built a natural gas power plant that leaks methane into the atmosphere. That's a new emission. They aren't really built to consider oscillation and ongoing emissions, say from wetlands or ruminants that have been contributing methane for centuries. And so I think that these limitations that we've characterized today, primarily around how we measure and assess the impacts of methane, give us some direction and some opportunity. As animal scientists, we might be best suited to tackle the first one. Are there better ways for us to characterize beef systems and the methane emissions that they generate so that we might have clear prioritization of where mitigation efforts can be applied? The second would be if we have better understanding of the impact of those emissions over time. Then certainly that would improve our ability to identify the gap towards climate neutrality of these systems. And perhaps more importantly, give us better characterization of the impact of beef systems as they currently exist. It's my assertion that none of the methods that are currently employed to describe the impact of methane in the atmosphere from beef cattle emissions are very effective because of their lack of correspondence with atmospheric accumulation, and that perhaps direct modeling of warming effects from an accumulation model coupled with a climate emulation tool would give us clear understanding of what the sustainability with regard to climate neutrality is and the trade-offs that might be incurred should we make certain mitigation decisions. And so I appreciate very much the opportunity to visit with y'all today. I hate very much that I had to do that remotely, but I suppose for me, better remote than not at all. So